It's my pleasure to tell you that we'll move on to the next portion, which is elections, and that's going to be facilitated by Scott Rennie. Scott.
I always like to bring up lots of material because then you assume I have read it. Had I remembered I was doing this, I would have worn a white lab coat for even more credibility. So looking at the elections. In the club bylaws, it indicates whether you hold elections annually or semi-annually. If you are a club that meets weekly, you can opt to have the officers as a 6-month term instead of a 12-month term. And in January of this year, we had one club of our 110 that was like that, but that was an accident. In fact, they missed the second round renewal of officer lists because they didn't know somehow it had got changed accidentally when they meant to change something else in their bylaws. So all of our clubs in District 64 elect annually, and as the Toastmaster bylaws or constitution says, it is the first meeting in May that election is supposed to occur. Now there are in general 2 types of clubs. There are those clubs where it is twisting arms to get club officers. And there are those clubs where club officer positions are hotly contested. And that really determines how you're going to tackle the elections. Within the bylaws, it states that officer elections are to be by secret ballot unless dispensed with by unanimous consent of the club. So when you're in a club where it's like pulling teeth to get club officers, and when you have finally come up with at least the minimum 3 officers required, president, secretary, and 1 vice president, or all 7 officers. If there is nobody stating an interest beyond that, then usually the club will say, let's dispense with secret ballot and let's just go with show of hands. When there are actually going to be contested elections, then it is far better to do it by secret ballot. At business meetings, if you are voting by yay, nay, show of hands, some public form of voting, the chair typically does not vote except to affect the results. In other words, if there is a tie and the chair is in favor of something, they would cast a vote in favor. If the votes in favor was 1 greater and the chair wasn't in favor of the motion, they would vote against it, creating a tie and the motion would lose. However, when you were voting by secret ballot, the chair votes with everyone else. So at a club election, everybody would be filling out ballots. And we did talk about quorum, and that being the majority of the active members. So let's say, for instance, the club has 17 active members. So what would quorum be?
9.
Now, in the elections, begin with the top office and work the way down. So you begin with your vote on the president. And let's say in counting the ballots, there are 2 people running for president, and Joe has 4 ballots cast for him, which is greater than 10. Is that sufficient number of votes?
Yeah.
A quorum of 9, and 4 votes are being cast for the president, for Joe.
Well,
That's not enough.
so how many did the other one?
5?
How many did the other one get?
Quorum matters, but not in the counting of the ballots. When you read the instructions, that's right, you need quorum. In order to elect an officer, it must be by majority vote, but it is by the majority of those casting a ballot. So if only 4 people voted and all 4 voted for Joe, that's the majority. If in fact 7 voted and 3 voted for Frank and 4 voted for Joe, that is still a majority. So that's a tricky bit. If you have 3 people and the vote gets split, where you have, again, looking at, say, 9 votes being cast, and there were 2, 3. Doesn't work out. But maybe when you split it, the person that gets the most votes may not win. You need a majority. So it turns out that Frank might have more votes cast for him than for the other 2, but if it's not more than 50% of the votes, then you hold another round of voting.
But doesn't everyone who is present vote?
Not necessarily. Somebody might go out to the washroom, go out to do lunch. Somebody might not like either of the people running, so opts not
So they
to.
won't vote. So some people will not vote at all.
Yep.
So even though the quorum is 9,
Right.
you may have maybe 5
See, that's
people vote.
one of life's little mysteries that I can't figure out is that in a business meeting, you sort of start out with announcement of what is quorum,
Yes.
and then they will say that means that X number is a majority and X number is a 2/3 vote. And yet that really isn't the case, because it all depends on who votes on a particular motion. So you're really only looking at the majority or 2/3 of the ballots cast. And then it can get really complicated when you get into, is it a spoiled ballot and so forth, and whether that counts in the overall number. But I think for our purposes, there's no need to go there. Yes?
What happens if there's a tie?
If there's a tie
4-4,
again,
let's say.
then you'll need to run another round of voting.
Okay, so do you let the candidates get up and give a spiel, so maybe they'll change something? Otherwise you could be in deadlock.
Could be. And even if it's not a tie, the fact that if there isn't a clear majority, you still need to hold another vote. And in the club bylaws, it does not state that the lowest member needs to be dropped. And in Robert's rules, it states that it is not a requirement that the lowest member be dropped. And consequently, you can have the same three people running vote after vote after vote, and the real stalemate evolving. I don't know if that
Lowest
has
number
ever
or
actually
lower
happened.
number of votes, you mean?
The lowest number of votes, often in conventions and stuff, it will be that the lowest number gets dropped off, which is a bylaw
Yeah,
thing.
like the NDP thingy.
Right, most conventions will do that because we don't want to be there forever. But it isn't written in our bylaws that you have to go there. So if there simply one person standing for each office, then you begin with the president, ask for any further nominations. We're assuming that there won't be any, and then you can just sort of do a show of hands, and as long as assuming that nobody has objected to that, so there's a unanimous consent to dispense with the secret ballot. Show of hands for who's in favor, show of hands for who's opposed, and as long as the majority are in favor, then you go on to the next officer. In a situation, yes.
Sorry, do you have to do that if there is only one candidate?
There,
Like you had said initially that you could choose to dispense with the secret ballot
right.
if there was only one candidate standing. And I guess my question at that point was, can you do that for each position, or do you have to do that for the whole election?
I would suggest the expectation, because even when you think you've only got one person running for each position, still go through the motions of any nominations from the floor and go to the next office, the next office, the next office. And if somebody does jump up and say, yes, I want to run, then I would suggest it would be appropriate for somebody to object to the open ballot and insist on a secret ballot.
The intent, I believe, is that if the nominating committee can present a slate of officers, right? And you recognize that. But I think it's important to announce during elections that any nominations from the floor by somebody, you're voting somebody else, that they had to approach them before, if they would run.
Right, and that's, Toastmasters is different from Robert's Rules in that regard. Robert's Rules with nominations say that you don't need to get the person's approval, but if they're elected, they sort of have an immediate opportunity to turn it down, whereas Toastmasters does clearly say that for somebody to be nominated, they have to